even though everything that happened with Jesus Christ was preordained and foreordained by God, and that it all came together according to his sovereign plan and purpose, it's important for us to acknowledge that the things that happened to him from the hands of his enemies were indeed evil. And we've seen traces of this, even just going into not even just things that we've seen earlier in our study of the book of John, but even in the last chapter, and how the capture of Jesus and the trial, if you want to call it that, against Jesus, that was brought before his enemies, just kind of seeing just kind of the evil behind it. And so we've been seeing that. We've been continuing to see that all throughout our study, at least of chapter 18. But as we start into chapter 19, I don't know if you'll see it as well, but for me, we see here an evil that gets more and more apparent and more real. Well, it's always been real. Maybe that's not the right term to use, but more and more in your face, I guess. And it all centers on the actions and the behaviors of Pontius Pilate. Now, we spent the last couple of weeks talking about Jesus and his encounter with Pontius Pilate. And in a way, we continue to see that now. But in this episode, as we continue our study of the book of John, and as we start in chapter 19, we become more and more aware of just how evil Pilate is, and how his action in sentencing Jesus is. I think the evilness of sentencing an innocent man is a given, but understanding all the things that are foundational and contextual to this whole thing, we can see more and more. Plus, the actions that we see take place in this text, we can see just how evil Pilate is, and even how evil his enemies are. The Romans are, the Jews are at this time in this situation. So we're going to unpack all of that. Again, speaking of the evil of man, I mean, we see it here, but it's also on the same side. We see this all happening according to the plan and foreknowledge of God. And we'll touch on that a little bit as well. We've been doing it in previous episodes before, and we still see some semblances of that in our passage that we're going to look at in this episode, which, by the way, is John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So let's not delay any further. Some good things in store. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, well, before we get into the text of Scripture that we're going to be looking at in this episode, let me remind you that if you enjoy Loving the Scriptures and you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to this podcast. Also, go ahead and follow me on X. Again, the handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. If this is your first time listening to Loving the Scriptures, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I hope that what we have to offer here on this podcast is helpful and profitable for you spiritually. And as I mentioned before, we're in the middle of a study of the book of John, which we've been in for a couple of years, and a lot of good things that we've seen in this journey. I think I may have mentioned this last time, but I'll say it again, that if you want access to the full playlist of our study of the book of John, I'll leave a link of that in the episode description. It'll take you to the YouTube playlist, and from John 1 all the way up to whatever's current is what we have in our study of the book of John. So if that's something that you want to go back and listen to previous episodes, that's at your disposal in a little bit more convenient sort of setup there. So, but yeah, as far as where we are right now, John chapter 19. And again, if you remember, like I said, the last couple of weeks we've been looking at Jesus before Pontius Pilate, a man who, let's remind ourselves of this because again, this is important, that where Pilate is historically, by the time this incident comes up, he's in a very tough spot because he's already, is kind of on thin ice. I think is the way that I kind of put it there, because he's had trouble keeping the peace, and he's done some things to provoke the Jews to anger and near riots. Pilate has, on a few occasions, come across as a brutal man, slaughtering people and that sort of thing. And so, from a historical context, we have that historical record of Pilate. But then, as we talked about before, we look at the gospel records and we don't see that kind of person. In fact, we see somebody who is kind of like a jellyfish, and he's kind of spineless, and it's like he's afraid of the people. So what are we talking about here? If we keep in mind and we understand that because of Pilate's past aggressions, and even with the Jews appealing to Caesar and saying, hey, Pilate's doing a bad job and he's doing this and that, he's already on thin ice with the superiors and with Caesar himself. And so any other incidences that might lead to another near riot, or Pilate misbehaving and slaughtering people unnecessarily or something like that, may lead to the plug being pulled on his governorship of Judea. And so really, when it comes to this incident with Jesus and then bringing Jesus before him, all of that has to loom in the background of our minds to kind of fully grasp and understand what's going on and why Pilate is acting the way that he is. As we're going to see in this passage, he does, what he can to try and save Jesus from sentence of death and things like that. But then, of course, if we know the gospel record, we know for the gospel itself, we know that Jesus was sentenced and he was handed over to be killed by crucifixion. And so we look at Pilate and say, that it's a weak man. Well, he was dealing with a lot of things historically, which that doesn't excuse him, by the way. Again, remember, the name of the game here is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Pilate is evil. And we're going to see how that evil just kind of expresses itself as we go through this passage. But even in the last episode, we had Pilate questioning Jesus, because he asked him, "Are you a king?" And then Jesus goes on and saying that, my kingdom is not of this world. And my if it were, my servants would have fought to keep me from being captured. And Pilate, by the way, has to ask this because, kind of as a secondary answer to the question, what has Jesus done here to the Jews? They throw out this suggestion saying that he sets himself up as a king and tells our nation to refuse to pay tribute to Caesar and that sort of thing. So if that truly is a thing, Pilate has to at least ask some questions about that and investigate that, lest he just kind of let Jesus go. And the Jews, if they were unhappy about that, which I'm sure they would appeal to Caesar and saying, we brought him somebody who we accused of wanting to set himself up as king, and Pilate doesn't seem to care, and he just let him go. That would really not be good for Pilate. So Pilate has to ask this, and after questioning Jesus and everything, he comes to the determination, as we saw near the end of chapter 18, that he saw no guilt in him. He looks at Jesus and listens to what Jesus says, is like, this guy it poses no threat to Caesar or to Rome or anything like that. But he wants to use the Passover custom that is customary, a customary custom, where the Romans release a prisoner to the Jews, and as we saw, the Jewish people, stirred up by the chief priests, cry out to have Barabbas released and Jesus to be crucified. And well, I mean, they didn't yell crucify him yet. I mean, at least in John's account here, but they say they don't want Jesus to be let go, but they want Barabbas to be let go. Which exposes the evil contradiction that's in their hearts, and I think this is what Pilate was betting on, was that by offering up Barabbas next to Jesus and saying, which one do you want to have released to you, as it's laid out in Matthew, he has Pilate presenting it to kind of as a choice, which one of these two. Barabbas was guilty of insurrection. He was an insurrectionist. And so he was guilty, in fact, of the things that Jesus has been accused of doing without evidence. So I think the hope was, again, for the choice to be set up before them, and then the Jews would have no other choice but to let Jesus go, because if they say let Barabbas go, I mean they're saying let Barabbas go for the same crime that we're accusing Jesus of doing, but yet there's no evidence of that. But the fact that they cry out for Barabbas to be released to them exposes the contradictory evil heart and nature of everything, even from the Jewish side. And so that's where we kind of find ourselves as we go into chapter 19. So in going in chapter 19, let me go ahead and read the passage itself. Again, the verses that we're going to be looking at are verses 1 through 16. And so this is what it says here. It says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, 'See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him.' So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, 'Behold the man.' When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" And Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So there you have the evil sentence that's carried, that is given against Jesus, even though we know, and even though Pilate himself knows, that there's no guilt in him. With all the accusations that have been brought against him, there's no guilt against Jesus Christ. He's completely innocent. And the fact that he's innocent, I mean, if we, just keep that in mind as we go back and we start to take this passage apart in John chapter 19, we start out in verse 1, because remember, again, it says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him." Okay, so Pilate had him flogged. Now, again, after declaring that he finds no guilt in Jesus, Pilate has Jesus punished as if he was guilty. Now, the thing about flogging, other terms that we use is scourging. Scourging was often a punishment that preceded crucifixion. And if you know anything about scourging, you know that the Roman scourging action, that the whole punishment of that was very, very severe. Usually the scourging was done with a whip, a series of leather strips on a handle, like a wooden handle or whatever, and tied to the end of these leather straps or strips or anything. You had a variety of things. You had metal and bone, and I think with some there were shards of glass that are tied onto the end of that. So when you whip the person, it totally rips and lacerates the flesh. And this wasn't anything where, it's just like, a few quick lashes that are really painful, and that's it. I mean, with Roman scourging, the people who administered that punishment, they went to town. And so this punishment was very, very, very severe. And in some sense, I think you could say it was deliberately so, not simply because they wanted it to be severe. I mean, they wanted it to be severe, but in some cases, I think they hoped that the crucifixion that would follow would be shorter than normal had the scourging not happened, even though, even with scourging, somebody hanging on the cross could be hanging up there alive for days. So even with the scourging, the crucifixion that follows is still a long extended process. But here's the thing, though. And, this is something that would happen from time to time, I think, is that with Roman scourging of somebody before they went to the cross, the beating would be so severe because you have a lot of blood loss. You have a lot of blood loss, and people go into shock and all sorts of other things. Some criminals died before they even made it to the cross. Before the crucifixion was even carried out, the beating would be so severe that the criminal would die. So if that gives you an understanding of what we're dealing with, some people, might be familiar with and may still have in their memory if they saw the movie, The Passion of the Christ. One of the things that was attempted to be depicted through that whole process was in the scourging scene, which seemed to go on, for a long time. I don't know how many minutes that whole scene was. But that's the whole thing with scourging, was that it was something that was severe. And so imagine this then. You have Jesus who is lacerated. He would be tied up to a pole or a post, and his back and his butt exposed and everything like that. And they would just whip and whip and whip and whip. And so with all these elements at the end of the straps, I mean, it was just rip and rip and rip away at his flesh. Okay. And so so when it says that Pilate had Jesus flogged, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a scourging. So again, remember though, that this was done to somebody that Pilate had declared he finds no guilt in him, but he had Jesus punished as if he was guilty. And so this whole scourging thing, you can kind of look at it like this, in the sense that Pilate was, at this point, had no intention of having Jesus crucified. That wasn't on his radar screen. Of course, we know by the end of the passage that Jesus would be handed over to be crucified. But Pilate had no intention at that moment of having Jesus crucified. So having Jesus scourged was, I guess you could say, kind of used as a compromise, or at least he hoped it would be a compromise, kind of like a halfway action in order to satisfy the Jews. You'll see that here in a little bit. I think that's what he was going after. Now, even if scourging wasn't severe like that, and we're just talking about a bad whipping or something like that, that's still messed up. That's still completely messed up to have that done to somebody who's innocent, who didn't commit any sort of crime. So the fact that it was severe just kind of just adds on to the evil nature of everything here. And again, what we're doing here and what we're seeing with Pilate is that Pilate, again, is trying to save his own political bacon. So in order to save his own political bacon, he is willing to have an innocent man scourged severely as he was. Okay, that is truly, truly evil and truly, truly wicked. Okay, and so one of the things that you have here, Pilate had him scourged, flogged, and as we go on to say in verse 2, it says, and the soldiers are the ones. It says in verse 1 that Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, but I don't think the idea is that Pilate himself did the actual action of flogging and whipping. I mean, he had other people who were in charge of doing that. And I think that in verse 2, the soldiers here were the ones that administered that. And you also have what they go on to do, as we see here in verse 2. So in verse 2, it says, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. So you see kind of how the soldiers themselves mock Jesus. And these are from a group of people where, I mean, you can sense that there's a little bit of a disdain, not only but for Jesus himself, but I mean, the fact that maybe he was a Jew didn't, kind of contributed to that as well. Because remember, Jewish attitude towards Romans and vice versa wasn't all that good anyway. You might wonder what kind of, why would the soldiers care so much to even do this to Jesus? Well, I think that, his Jewish ethnicity was part of it, but even his claims and everything was kind of ridiculous. And so that, that led them to, to carry on in this mocking sort of way, because they in their mind saw this as ridiculous. Now, see, because, you can imagine Jesus scourged and he's ripped up and he's bleeding and things like that. And so Jesus's appearance, accompanied with the claim that Jesus himself was making, is that he was a king, was a totally ridiculous notion to the human eye, and I would probably say to these soldiers who were mocking Jesus. I mean, and even if you think about this from a Roman/Gentile perspective, I don't think anybody would imagine Caesar, a true king in their eyes, looking like Jesus did, or Caesar allowing people to treat him like this. I mean, I'm pretty sure with Caesar, with the power that he had, he can just tell people, get rid of this lot and do away with them, and the people would jump to his command and do such a thing. And no such thing was true for Jesus. In fact, Jesus, again, remember what Jesus had even said to Pilate, in saying that if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight to keep me from being captured by the Jews. So, that's what you have going on there. So all of this put together makes for, in the minds of these soldiers here, a pretty ridiculous display as they're looking at Jesus and everything. Now, as we see here, we come up on some familiar things as it relates to this mockery. Number one, you see the whole thing of a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head. And so, a lot of us are familiar with the whole thing of crown of thorns. People have done paintings of Jesus and the crucifixion and everything. You see this whole thing of a crown of thorns that was placed on his brow. And a lot of people believe that, the crown of thorns may have been pressed down on his brow to kind of cause pain. And that may be the case, but I think that the humiliation factor of this, and just the way that a crown of thorns would just look on his head, was the main factor that they were going for. Maybe they did it to inflict pain at the same time, but I think in large part what loomed was the look. It was the outward look, the outward spectacle of Jesus. Somebody who claimed to be a king, and instead of having a diadem of gold or something like that, you have this crown of thorns that's placed on his head, and saying, aha, King of the Jews, look at you, that sort of thing. I think the humiliation factor is what their intention truly was. So you have the crown of thorns there, and then it says, and arrayed him in a purple robe. I think it's in Luke where it says that it was a scarlet robe. So you get the idea that it's kind of close, maybe somewhere in between, kind of a reddish purple, sort of thing, that it's something that the Romans would have attributed to royalty or that sort of thing. Even if you go with the color purple itself, I mean, you're talking about a color of royalty, and that's the whole idea. Because again, they're mocking Jesus, who's saying that he is a king. Now, remember, we might not remember. We didn't explore in detail the things, in other synoptics, when specifically in Luke, when Jesus is given to King Herod. But Herod, if you read in Luke 23:11. We see that Herod also used a wardrobe to mock Jesus. The words that are used there in that verse in Luke 23, it says splendid clothing. So, they put splendid clothing on him, and they, it's clear, from the text that Herod is mocking Jesus. So you get mockery from Herod. You get mockery from these soldiers who had done the deed of even beating Jesus. And as he sees there in verse 3, that said, they came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." So obviously they're doing this to make fun of Jesus. They say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. So there's physical abuse that's going on here. Now, again, we have to understand that Jesus has been slapped around a bit even before. Remember the whole thing before he even appeared before Caiaphas. He had people slapping him and saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you?" and that sort of thing. And here, he's getting smacked around by the Roman soldiers with their hands. In Matthew and Mark, it says that they struck him in the head with a reed. Okay, so, that's not contradictory. It's like, both can be true at the same time, but each of the synoptics emphasize one over the other. So with their hands and with a reed that's used on his head, they strike Jesus. And also in Matthew and Mark, it says that they spit upon him as well. So abusive, yes, all of this is going on. And again, this is, in their minds, a ridiculous display of somebody who claimed to be a king. Again, from their vantage point, they might think of somebody like Caesar and said, nothing like this would be true of Caesar. You're a joke if you're claiming yourself to be a king, and that sort of thing. So as we continue on here, after the mockery there in verse 4, it says, Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Okay, so brings him out. Pilate hoped, and I think, the whole idea here, again, Pilate hoped that in bringing Jesus out in this mock display here, and he's probably bruised up, just in the face and stuff too, from being hit and beaten, everything like that. So, he's lacerated. His body is lacerated. He's got this purple robe, and he's got this ridiculous looking crown of thorns placed on his head. So he obviously looks like somebody who doesn't pose any sort of threat. And so Pilate, his idea is bringing him out in this mocked display. I think his hope was that the crowd's passions would cool, and that they would see that the punishment that Pilate had inflicted on Jesus was enough. He brings him out and says, okay, man, they did a number on this guy. He looks totally ridiculous, and he's totally beat up and lacerated. Okay, we hate the guy, and we see that what you've done with him is enough. Okay, we can let him go. We won't call for his crucifixion and that sort of thing. You would think that would be the way it was, and I think that that's what Pilate was counting on. But the crowd instead calls out for his crucifixion. So, it says there that in verse 5, it says, "So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, 'Behold the man,'" probably again in a mocking tone and an expectation that Jesus would that the Jews would realize that there was nothing more to be done. This, like, at one look, and they'd say, "Okay, that's sufficient. That's sufficient." But again, that's not what happened, because as it goes on to say, in verse 6, it says, "When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, 'Crucify him, crucify him.'" Wow. Even after seeing what they did to Jesus and what had happened to him, that wasn't enough for them. It wasn't enough. They cry out, "Crucify him, crucify him," because they hate him so. Just imagine the level of hatred that you would have to possess to see all of that's done to Jesus and still say, "That's not enough. We want him dead." And so here we go. We go to this whole thing of, or still in the middle of verse 6, where it says, "Pilate said to them, 'Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him.'" I find no guilt in it. I don't know how many times Pilate has said this, but he's made it pretty clear to the people that he doesn't find any guilt in Jesus Christ. So here's the thing: he finds no guilt in Jesus as it relates to any threat to Caesar or to Rome. Because remember, even on a secondary basis, that's the accusation they were lodging against him. He claims to be a king, and so he leads the nation astray, and they don't want the nation to pay tribute to Caesar and that sort of thing. That whole thing is going on in their minds, and Pilate, after all of this, he's saying, there's no guilt, and then There's no threat to Caesar or to Rome or anything like that. And so what we see here, because that's the case, we're right back to where we were in chapter 18, verse 31. Remember what we saw there when they first brought when they first brought Jesus to Pilate there. Remember he asked, what accusation you have against him? In verse 30, it says, they answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. And then in verse 31, and Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. So that's where we are right now. He finds no guilt or no in Jesus in the fact that there's no threat to Caesar or to Rome. So now we're back to the whole thing, judge him according to your law. Now it's because if he was to be punished, and now it had to be based on a Jewish problem. Now again, even if it was based on a Jewish problem, the execution and everything that would be carried out on Jesus would have to be done by Roman hands, because again, Jews were prohibited from doing that themselves. And the Jews, if we remember before in our analysis in previous episodes, brought that up to Pilate. But now we've come full circle here, and Pilate is again giving them the green light once again. So we're back to that. He gives them the green light for the Jews to do it themselves. And again, all of this is working out because, again, in chapter 18 and verse 32, we're reminded of why all of this is going on. It says this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. If Pilate was giving them the green light to put Jesus to death, he said, go and crucify him yourself. But the idea, if this was a Jewish problem and the Jewish problem was blasphemy, they would resort to stoning probably and not crucifixion, right? And so again, in order for Jesus's words to hold true and his prediction to hold true, which all is based on God's sovereign preordained plan, that Jesus would be killed by crucifixion, we see in this narrative here the continuation of this leading up to the actual manner in which Jesus died, which Jesus himself had said, this is the way that it's going to happen. And that was something that was going to be fulfilled. So here, the Jews don't simply follow through with the second green light that Pilate gives to them. And in fact, here's what we have going on here. This is interesting here. So Pilate had said, he said, crucify him, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. Then in verse 7, it says, the Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. So on its face, you might look at that, you might read that, and you might think, okay, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? So, because the Jews now here seem to acknowledge that it is a Jewish thing. Have they abandoned the whole thing of parading Jesus forth as a threat to Caesar? No, we'll see that here in a second. But I mean, they do acknowledge here that there's a Jewish element to this as well, because they're saying, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die. Why? Because he has made himself the Son of God. Okay. Now here's the thing. Let's keep something straight here. Just keep something in mind here. Again, without Roman action against Jesus, I think the Jews maybe thought that many Jews would be against them if they had put Jesus to death themselves, even though they have, they'd been able to stir the crowd up at that time to shout for Barabbas to be released and not Jesus to be released. They may have been afraid that there would still be a large segment of Jews, maybe Jews that weren't present at this proceeding, that when Jesus would be put to death, then that would really turn an angry eye against them. And so in order to cover themselves, they're still looking for a way to absolve themselves from this and to try and get this to go down by Roman hands. And so with what the Jews are laying forth here in verse 7, they might be saying, yeah, we have a law, and according to that law, he has to die. The second part of that, I think, is something that's laid forth before Pilate that's very deliberate here, that's supposed to stir him up. And that thing, again, that he says is that because he has made himself the Son of God. Now, laying that forth there, is, I believe that this was a deliberate move, again, to gin up, a lot of fear in Pilate. And that's exactly what we see in the next verse. Because it says there in verse 8, it says, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He was even more afraid. Now, again, notice here, Pilate was more afraid. So he was afraid initially because he's already in this precarious situation. The Jews are bringing Jesus to him, and now he's trying to tread lightly with the Jews and with Caesar at the same time, pretty much. And so all of this is a fearful thing for him, because he knows that at any moment, if he does the wrong thing, it makes the Jews mad. The Jews appeal to Pilate and saying, hey, to Caesar and saying, hey, Pilate's doing wrong, that sort of thing, then Pilate can be done for. Now here with what they say, because he makes himself the Son of God, which again, I think is a deliberate move on the Jews' part. And it says that Pilate is even more afraid. Also keep in mind, this isn't in John, but in Matthew's account, Pilate had been approached by his wife and said, have nothing to do with this innocent man because of a dream that I had about him. So all these things are coming together, all at once. And it's like, I'm even more afraid now. And so as it says there in verse 8, as it says, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, where are you from? Where are you from? Now, this was not a matter of, asking this question, just to kind of get this, a better grasp on his geography. There was something else that was going on here. So, again, I think what we have to understand, aside from the whole thing of, the foundational situation that Pilate was in right now, with this info that Pilate has received from the Jews, that Jesus claims to be the Son of God, Pilate sees it possible that a God, one of many gods, but a God has come and visited in human form. And thus he has, if that's true, then he's mistreated this God who's come in human form. Now, the interesting thing is that is true. We do have God that has come in and has come in human form, but not with. But Pilate is thinking all of this, without the one true God in mind. Again, there are multiple gods, and there was a superstitious belief by many in the paganistic world that a God can come to and come among his people and visit his people and appear in human form. You might remember, for example, if you were to look at the book of Acts in chapter 14, remember when Paul and Barnabas were teaching and preaching, I think, was it in Derbe? No, it was in Lystra, I think. I'd had to go back and look for the specific place. But there was a crippled person there that Paul healed, and then when the surrounding people saw the healing, they said the gods have come to us in human form. That was something that many people believe could happen, and if a god came in human form and they were mistreated, by people, then that would be a really serious thing. And so Pilate, it seems like Pilate was one who believed this. So the Jews, and I think the Jews know this. So this is just another card that the Jews are playing and saying that he's claimed to be, he makes himself to be the Son of God. Are you afraid yet? Sort of thing. And so Pilate is. And so when he asks, where are you from? This is not a matter of geographical location in him asking where he's from. Okay. In a way, Jesus had already answered this question about where he's from, because he'd already said, my kingdom is not of this world. So we know that whatever we're talking about as far as Jesus's origin, it's otherworldly. It's not of this world. We're dealing with something totally different, totally transcendent. We're dealing with someone totally different, totally transcendent here. So in a way, Jesus has already answered this question. But instead of talking here, as we saw Jesus do in chapter 18, here in chapter 19, he remains silent. So there in In verse 9, again, it says he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. All right. Now, this isn't the first time that Jesus has remained silent when people have asked him questions or if accusations have been lodged against him. Example of this is Matthew 26:63. When he's before Caiaphas, people are throwing all sorts of accusations against him, and he did not answer a word. Right. And it goes along with familiar prophecy texts that we see in Scripture, specifically if you're familiar with probably the most famous messianic prophecy of all, Isaiah 53, which prophesies about Jesus and prophesies about his death. But even there in verse 7, it says he was oppressed and was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So we're seeing this, we see this with Jesus before the Jews, and we see this even now with Jesus before Pilate. And so when Pilate asks, "Where are you from?" he remains completely silent. Jesus doesn't answer a word. So, and the thing is that, going further into who he truly is, if Jesus were, was going further into who he truly is, when Pilate is this afraid, if Jesus were to go and say and expand more on his deity and things like that, and while Pilate was afraid, that may have led him to let him go. But Jesus has a divine sacrificial purpose in all this, so he won't do anything that would serve to reverse that. So when Pilate is saying, "Where are you from?" Jesus is silent, so that, giving that information in the fear state that Pilate is in doesn't allow Pilate to then say, "I got to let you go because I've mistreated this man who actually is a God in human form, in human flesh." So so Jesus just keeps his mouth closed. And so, from Pilate's perspective, this is unusual. And even from probably any human thought and any human thinking, any human observation, this might be something that's unusual as well. Nevertheless, though, you have in verse 10 where it says, "So Pilate said to him, 'You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?'" So again, the whole thing is, you can imagine Pilate in this situation saying, "Won't you speak to me? You won't even speak to me. You won't even say anything." Jesus' silence is shocking under the circumstances, right? Anyone who was innocent of a crime, as Pilate believed of Jesus, again, Pilate believed Jesus to be innocent. There was no guilt in him. Anybody who's innocent of a crime would normally jump at the chance to proclaim whatever is necessary that would exonerate him from death, right? So if there's something that needs to be said that Jesus could say to make him escape this whole thing, you would expect that naturally that this would come forth. And Pilate's only responding to the accusations that he's heard from the Jews. So if this is true, let's get this out on the table and let's talk about this. Jesus remains silent. And he says, "Won't you even speak to me? You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" So this whole thing of authority here, Pilate brings up, and Jesus speaks about authority, which once again reminds us, again, it seems like we keep getting reminders again and again and again and again about the sovereign nature of this whole thing. And that this isn't just some sort of unfortunate happenstance that's outside of God's control and that sort of thing. That's not what we're dealing with here. And Jesus in his words here, suggests as such. And so what he says there in verse 11, it says, Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Okay. So he says there, you would have no authority over me. And I love this. You would have no authority over me at all, at all, unless it had been given you from above. So everything that happens here, again, this is the sovereignty of God at work. Everything was working out for Jesus to be before Pilate, according to God's sovereign plan and purpose, and allowing these things to happen. So this is from the hand of God, and so this is, this has been brought forth as not in any authority that Pilate exercises over Jesus is exercised over him because God is allowing that to happen. God, in his sovereign purpose and sovereign will, is allowing this to happen and is allowing for Pilate to exercise authority over him. That's what we have, and that's why he says, "You would have no power over me at all, unless it had been given you from above." I think that's what it truly means. I mean, in a sense, you can say that authority had been given to him because we see, kings and governors and that sort of thing that, they're put in place by God himself. And we're talking about the theology behind government and government officials and that sort of thing. We can say that in a broad sense. I think in a more narrower sense, we're talking about Pilate in this situation here. He would have no power over him. That's what Jesus is saying. You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you, from above. So everything is working out for Jesus to be before Pilate according to God's sovereign purpose, so that he could carry out the sentence of death by crucifixion, as Jesus himself had said. Right? And if you really think about it, the situation in itself, if you sit and think about it for a little bit, has the sovereignty of God written on it too. When we take into account the whole situation that we've reviewed a few times already of Pilate's predicament, his predicament in this situation, and trying to tread lightly with the Jews and also with Caesar, because you can see that it's under God's plan and purpose that he's carrying out to be for Christ to be the sacrificial, the sacrificial victim for your sake and for my sake, happening and being brought before Pilate at this moment in history when Pilate is dealing with all of this. When under normal circumstances, if the Jews brought Jesus over here, and there isn't any sort of pressure that Pilate is dealing with surrounding all of this, under normal circumstances, Pilate would be like, "Get out of here! This is a joke. I find no guilt with him. Get away from me." That sort of thing. But because of the situation that he's in, we have all of this going on, and we see eventually that Pilate would hand Jesus over to be crucified. Is it just out of coincidence that Jesus at this point in history comes before this man under this pressure and that sort of thing? No, I think that this all plays out into the sovereign hand of God as well. And so God allows this to happen. And so who truly has the authority? Ultimately, God has the authority, but part of that authority is allowing Pilate to exercise his authority over the Son of God. But believe you me, all of this is part of the plan and foreknowledge of God, and is according to his purpose. It is according to his sovereign plan. And notice what he says there. He says, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." And it says, "Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Now, who's he referring to there when he's talking about the one delivered me over to you, and that person having the greater sin? I believe that what's being talked about here is Caiaphas. If not in a more general sense, the Jews in general. But if we're talking about somebody specifically, we're talking about Pilate, not Judas. Some people have maybe offered Judas as a possibility of who he's referring to, but I don't think Judas is in mind here, because again he says, "Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Judas didn't do that. Judas just handed him over to his fellow Jews. And then from there, the Jews, the Jews and the enemies of Jesus went and handed him over to Pilate. Okay. So again, when in the synoptics, Jesus did declare himself to be the Son of God. They asked, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" And he said that I am. And they proceeded to say, okay, now we need to take him to Pilate. Now, again, remember, that wasn't the first charge that they brought against him when they talked to Pilate. Again, all that was secondary, and we see that appear again here in John 19. But whatever the case, they know they needed Roman authority in all of this if they wanted the execution of Jesus to go forward. And so, what we see here, and I think we even see it, let me see here, in the previous chapter, in chapter 18, in verse 28, then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. So they go from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters, which again, that's what they had determined. If you read the synoptics, you get the sense that that's the next step. They acknowledge this guy needs to be crucified. How does that happen? Not by us. So they go, and Caiaphas determines to have Jesus handed over to Pilate, and so therefore he is guilty of the greater sin. Now remember, Caiaphas is aware of Jesus' work, and yet, even with this knowledge, he still plotted to put Jesus to death. All you need to do is go back to John chapter 11. Remember that after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and I'm pretty sure that this isn't the only work that Caiaphas and everybody else knows about, obviously. This is one of the things that broke one of the straws that broke the camel's back for him, is this whole thing, because after Lazarus was raised from the dead, some people go and tell the authorities, and Caiaphas was one who was among their number, and saying that it might be necessary for one man to die rather than the whole nation perish. And so their plot was going on from there of how to put Jesus to death. So even with the evidence in front of him, you see what we're saying? This is something that is, we can see because of that there's a greater sin involved here. God's sovereignty is exercised so that Caiaphas and the Jews are allowed to capture and deliver Jesus over to Pilate. Now, remember, and I think I've mentioned this before, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before, God's sovereignty in this matter does not mean that he makes the Jews go after Jesus. Okay, that's not what we're dealing with here. Remember that the murderous intent was already in the hearts of the Jews before. I mean, you go back to places like chapter 7 and chapter 8. It says that they wanted to arrest Jesus, or they wanted to put Jesus to death, but nobody laid a hand on him because his time had not yet come, right? So it was already there, but you see the sovereignty of God, and even there where there's restraint, divine restraint, that didn't allow any of that to happen. Even when guards are dispatched to arrest Jesus, they come back empty-handed, and they say, "We never heard anybody speak like this man before." So again, the murderous intent was already in their hearts, but they were divinely restrained because Jesus' hour had not yet come. So the Jews and their rejection, now think of it like this, that restraint is removed, right? And so that restraint is removed. So we have the allowance of people, of these Jews, and the Jews' rejection in light of the great evidence on display before them makes them guilty of the greater sin. Because we can't necessarily say that somebody like Pilate was exposed to this evidence. Now, he is evil in the things that he's doing. Let's not get it twisted here. But considering all the things that the Jews have seen, and even Caiaphas specifically, Caiaphas knows what and who he's dealing with as far as the power of God working through this man and that sort of thing. And do we see when the restraints are removed, the divine sovereign restraints removed, we see a people who, in the midst of all the evidence, now carry forth, and their authority, in capturing Jesus and their power over Jesus and that sort of thing that he allows to happen there. So whether we're talking about the Jews, whether we're talking about Pilate itself, Jesus' authority is at work. And that authority involves the removal of restraints from the Jews who, with all the evidence, still continue to proceed to capture Jesus and hand him over to Pilate, who himself is evil as well. But both of them are evil, but he's saying that Caiaphas and maybe those allied with him are guilty of the greater sin. And that's what's being laid forth there. So in all of this, what we're seeing is evil and wickedness. There's no way around it. No way around this. It's very clear at this point. So as we go further here in verse 12, as we're coming closer to the end here, it says, from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar, right? So here's the thing. I mean, you could look at the beginning part of verse 12 there, which I just read there, where it says that from then on, Pilate sought to release him and think that, oh, Pilate is doing a noble thing here, okay? And maybe to a certain extent at this point he's trying to, but again, he's already had Jesus flogged. The evilness of all of this has already been expressed by having him physically beaten severely. So even though he's trying to rescue Jesus, I mean, there's still a lot of stuff on the table here. But it says that Pilate sought to release him, and I think that this area is an area where the Jews try and take advantage of Pilate even further. And the impression that you get from this verse is that they must have been aware that Pilate was trying to save Jesus and trying to have him released. And because of that, because of the sense that they get, they go on and say what they say in that verse. If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. That's the line that they use now. So they're aware of this, and they say what they say by letting Jesus go. Means that he's no friend of Caesar. And I guess in a way you can maybe consider this perhaps a veiled threat. If you let him go, you're no friend of Caesar. And if you're no friend of Caesar's, maybe you're a problem with Caesar. We can just waltz right up to him and appeal to him against you, and saying that Pilate's going against you in favor of somebody who says that he's a king and he plans on taking things over. Again, that puts Pilate in a very bad position. But the fact that this puts him in a bad position doesn't take away from his responsibility to do what is right and just and fair and that sort of thing. So the fact that he goes opposite of that highlights the evil all the more. Hopefully you're seeing that, right? So he's being under threat, I guess you could say, from all of this. And this isn't going well. So in verse 13 it says, so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, preparation day. It's basically what that's saying is that it was a Friday. That's what I don't think this is referring to anything here of a specific thing that they do on this particular day. Preparation day is also known as, it's another way of saying on the Friday of this Passover week. And when you look at resources like Alfred Edersheim kind of acknowledges that that's what this is referring to as a Friday. And even culturally today, in Greek, what's the word that's used? The Greek word that's used for the day of Friday is, means preparation. Is the same word. The preparation word, the word for preparation in Greek is used to label Friday in the Greek language even today. And so that's what this is referring to. And this is a Friday at the 6th hour, which is probably around noon or somewhere around there. Okay. And so Pilate is in response to this, because it says there in that verse, so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement. That sort of thing. He does all of this in response. He sits on the stone pavement. That's where judgments are pronounced, right? So he's getting ready to make his ruling, but I think we can kind of maybe see this as a last-ditch effort to get the Jews to see reason. Because again, he brings Jesus out with him, right, to this place, to the stone pavement, to this judgment seat, to Gabbatha. And in verse 14 it says, now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold your king. And it's almost as if, he's saying, this is Pilate's way of saying, do you expect me to believe that this man, your king, kind of said again, I think with mockery in mind, of both Jesus and the Jews, I think he's lumping both of them together, the accused and the accusers. Do you expect me to believe that this man, your king, is a danger to Caesar, that he serves some sort of dangerous threat to Rome and to Caesar and that sort of thing? Is that what you're expecting me to believe? I think is essentially what he's laying forth there. And so he says, behold your king. And in verse 15, it says, they cried out, away with him, crucify him. So no matter what Pilate tries, they keep saying the same thing. So this last-ditch effort to try and get them to see reason isn't working. And of course, if we see this from the sovereignty perspective of God, we know why. But they're continuing to say, away with him, crucify him. And so it says there, Pilate said to him, shall I crucify your king? Shall I do this? Shall I actually go and crucify your king? And their response, again, it goes into what it goes on to say, which is a very astonishing statement, really, when you get down to it, there in verse 16. So again, he says, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. That's verse 15. Excuse me. My apologies. Verse 15, where it says, we have no king but Caesar. That is an incredible statement that's made from a group of Jews whose resentment against Rome and against Roman occupation was off the charts, right? They would say anything to get rid of Jesus. This is totally opposite of the normal Jewish sentiment that they had. In fact, think about this. Their hope for the Messiah was for when he would appear and he would arrive, that he would take over as king. That was their actual hope for the Messiah. That's what they were looking forward to, and especially in this time of Roman occupation. The Messiah came, they would gleefully and gladly receive this man who came as Messiah and would take over as king and would rule from Jerusalem in peace and righteousness. They would have no problem with that. That's what they hoped for. So for them to say what they say in the midst of their time trying to murder the true king and Messiah, Jesus Christ, is outrageous. It's just outrageous. It's totally opposite of everything that they themselves claim that they hope for. And straight out saying that we have no king but Caesar. An outrageous statement given what their actual true sentiments were. And they were, in reality, killing or calling for the murder of their true king and Messiah. So yeah, that's messed up, right? I mean, to say the least, that's messed up. But again, this is all working out according to God's preordained plan that's laid out according to his sovereign purposes. And the sovereign purpose for Jesus to lay down his life for his sheep, which is you and me. This is all with you and me, and ultimately the glory of God and the glory of Christ in mind. What a wonder saying, even in the midst of all of this evil, they themselves weren't aware that they were laying things out according to God's perfect plan, perfect sovereign plan for the salvation of his people, as Jesus would lay his life down for his sheep, right? And that's what you have there. And so having fully rejected, as we see right here, and seeing that there's nothing, we've reached the end point here. There's nothing else that Pilate can do that would save him or save Jesus. The best that Pilate could do, and this is in the synoptics where he washes his hand with water and essentially says, I wash my hands of this, as if that is something that would absolve him from this. Pilate's evil, and he did an evil thing. So we shouldn't get it confused here that what we see here is somebody who is afraid and he's afraid of the Jews and that sort of thing. We see this weak man. We've seen brutality from Pilate before from a historical point of view. And the fact that all of this is centered on politics, essentially, and he's hands over, because even as we see here, so in verse 16, so he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Them being, handing him over to the wishes of the Jews. It would be the Romans and the Roman soldiers who would actually go through the act and that sort of thing. But he hands Jesus over to them to be crucified, knowing that he's innocent. In any sort of situation, if we knew that somebody was either locked in prison or executed on death or on death row and was later executed or something like that, and people knew, the people who administered all this from the top down knew that he was innocent, that would be outrageous. So the fact that Pilate is doing this, knowing that Jesus is innocent, is outrageous. And for the sake of saving his own political bacon, is outrageous. But again, from what is evil and wicked and outrageous from the human perspective, both on the side of the Jews and also the Gentiles in the person of Pilate and the Roman soldiers and all those people who participate in all this, there's good that results in salvation for you and me through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So again, we continue to see the sovereignty of God working his way through this, even in the midst of human evil. And so as we continue on next time, we're going to continue on in John chapter 19. We're going to continue on by examining the narrative description of the crucifixion and the things that happen there as we continue to go through this. So that's next on the agenda. So come back and we will explore that together. But for now, we're going to leave it there. So the narrative and the drama continues, and we'll explore that next time. If you enjoy this program, again, and if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to this podcast, and also be sure to follow me on X. Again, the handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right, well, I had a great time examining Scripture with you, as I always do. I hope you had a good time as well. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.